A quorum being present, the committee will be in order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of House Resolution H.R. 4470, the Protecting and Securing Chemical Facilities and Terrorist Attacks of 2023, H.R. 4467, the DHS Border Services Contracts Review Act, and H.R. 2577, the DHS Suicide Prevention and Resiliency for Law Enforcement Act. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, any requests for recorded votes may be postponed, and I now recognize myself for an opening statement. First, I want to thank the Ranking Member Thompson, and all our members for their cooperation leading up to today's markup. This bipartisan markup reflects our ability to come together to do work necessary to secure the homeland. We have three important matters to discuss today, Though we may not agree on every aspect of today's proceedings, I'm confident that each bill will receive broad support, and these measures, which are needed to improve the Department of Homeland Security, will be advanced. I'd like to speak on the bills offered by my Republican colleagues, H.R. 4470, the Protecting and Securing Chemical Facilities from Terrorist Attacks Act of 2023. It reauthorizes DHS's Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program until July 2025. This program identifies and regulates high-risk chemical facilities within the United States to ensure they have security measures in place to reduce the risks associated with chemicals of interest. It is the only federal program focused specifically on site security at facilities with chemicals of interest. And I want to thank Rep. Lee for her attention to this important program and regard for her constituents, as her district hosts many of these chemical facilities. We're on a very short timeline as the program expires at the end of this month, so it is of the utmost importance that we act as swiftly as possible. Members on both sides of the dais have expressed concern for certain aspects of the program and need for changes, which is why I have requested a report from the GAO due back within the coming year to look into the program's methodologies for reducing facility risk, cost, and potential redundancies. This shorter two-year reauthorization will give us enough time to consider issues and challenges with CFATS and make the necessary reforms. Anything longer will only allow Congress to do what it does best, and that's kick the can down the road and ignore the program until it needs to be reauthorized again. As you all know, there are a lot of strong opinions in this body about reauthorizing lengths and reforms. We have in this chamber and in this Senate colleagues who want a much longer reauthorization, and we have colleagues who want no reauthorization at all. We have painstakingly worked to come up with something that can pass both the House and the Senate, a two-year clean reauth. I know many of us have ideas and changes we would eventually like to see with CFATS, and in reviewing some of the amendments, I find several of them I like very much. However, our counterparts in the House and Senate have made it abundantly clear that any changes to the program or amendments to H.R. 4470 at this juncture would be a poison pill and will certainly end any chance of the program's extension. That's why we're doing this two-year reauthorization, to give members a chance to come together, Democrats and Republicans, House members and senators, to reach agreement on the reforms that are necessary. I urge all members to support the bill. Next is H.R. 4467. The DHS Border Services Contracts Review Act. This bill is an important measure that directs the Undersecretary of Management of DHS to assess active contracts for covered services performed by contractor personnel along the United States land border with Mexico, and to submit to Congress a report with recommendations on active contracts utilized for border support services. I'd like to extend my great appreciation to Representative Burkeen for introducing this legislation and addressing the red flags raised by DHS's Office of Inspector General about a lack of transparency and oversight concerning DHS border contracts. This bill passed through the committee in last Congress with broad bipartisan support, including an amendment by Representative Jackson Lee that is part of the base text of this current bill. I strongly encourage all members to support this legislation, as it will bring additional accountability to DHS. Lastly, I am very happy to support another bipartisan measure today, H.R. 2577, the DHS Suicide Prevention and Resiliency for Law Enforcement Act. This bill amends the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Program. Ranking Member Thompson introduced this as an amendment to the border bill for our markup in April. While we did not include it in that bill, I told the ranking member at that time that I committed to working with him on it and to get it back in front of this committee. H.R. 2577 provides a comprehensive approach to address the mental health and wellness of department law enforcement officers and agents. When suicide is at an all-time high and morale at an all-time low for DHS's Border Patrol, this measure is very timely, and I encourage all our members to support it. I now recognize the ranking member to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to be here to consider legislation to reauthorize the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards Program. In 2007, I was proud to have worked closely with committee colleagues and the Bush administration to stand up this vital security program. Committee Democrats have consistently supported CFATS while seeking to address critical security gaps that this committee has known about for at least half a decade. These long-standing issues haven't fixed themselves. This is why it's deeply disappointing that the committee is being asked to reauthorize CFATS without any changes. When I became chair of this committee again in 2019, CFATS was just a few weeks away from sunsetting. I introduced a short-term extension bill on the second day of the Congress, and it became law by January 18th of that year. By March, the committee had held multiple CFATS hearings, receiving testimony from government officials, the regulated community, and other stakeholders. At that time, witnesses raised concern about several issues, among them coordination and information sharing with first responders, the adequacy of training for chemical inspectors, particularly related to cybersecurity, the tiering methodology, drone threats to chemical facilities, and security gaps associated with facilities that are excluded from CFATS. That testimony informed our legislative efforts. By the time we left for August recess, we had moved a comprehensive vetted reauthorization bill through this committee that would have improved the security value of the program. Unfortunately, despite months of negotiation, jurisdictional challenges and political differences overtook efforts to make needed fixes in the CFATS program. Ultimately, committee Democrats had to stomach a short-term extension, the purpose of which was to give Congress more time to examine problems that we already knew existed. I understand that some of my Republican colleagues have indicated that they are just becoming familiar with the program and that the chairman has initiated a GAO report to evaluate the CFATS program, as he said in his opening statement. But I'd like to remind my colleagues that this committee, both Democrats and Republicans, have a robust oversight history with this program and is worth consulting. Today, committee Democrats are once again asked to support a date change bill to buy time to give members another opportunity to learn what we already know. There are problems with the program that Congress must address. Let's be clear about the issues we're putting on today. Should we adopt this ANS without amendment? For 5 years, this committee has known about major gaps in the way DHS oversees the coordination that is supposed to happen between a facility and their local first responders. In 2018, GAO found that far too often, emergency response personnel were not even aware that there were CFATS facilities in their communities. For those who did, they didn't know what chemicals were stored on site or how to handle them safely during an emergency. Democrats will be offering an amendment today to force DHS to step up to make sure this vital coordination happens. No one wants to see first responders meet the same fate as those who died in West Texas fertilizer plant explosion in 2013, or just this month on a cargo ship docked in the port of Newark. Additionally, Democrats will also offer amendments to improve longstanding weaknesses in the Inspector General program. For years, we have been hearing about the inadequacy of training provided by DHS. In our May roundtable, members again heard how inspectors are not getting the training they need to carry out inspections effectively, particularly with respect to cybersecurity, where threats and adversary tactics are dynamic. Congress must put CFATS in a position to keep pace with the rapid rise in cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. I know there's some concern about adopting amendments. It will complicate the reauthorization process. I would note that the amendments that Democrats plan to offer today do not mandate major program reforms. Instead, these modest amendments are aimed at refining the underlying statutes to address program challenges Congress has been aware of for over 5 years without placing new burdens on chemical facilities. I look forward to debate on our amendments, and I'm hopeful we can work across the aisle as we've done in the past to bolster the security of chemical plants across the nation. Additionally, I'm pleased that Chairman Green worked with me to advance legislation I introduced with Mr. Garbarino to establish a department-wide mental health program for law enforcement will be considered today. This bill is critical since in 2022, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported 15 suicides within its ranks, the most since 2007. It'll also help federal air marshals at TSA. A 2020 GAO report on the state of the federal air marshals workforce found widespread concern about key quality of life matters that included extreme fatigue and mental health issues. Between 2013 and 2019, 5 federal air marshals took their lives. The law enforcement community overwhelmingly supports this bill with endorsements from the National Treasury Employees Union, National Border Patrol Council, Blue Help, Concerns of Police Survivors, and the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. The Senate companion was scored by CBO at a modest $2 million over a 5-year period. I hope we can come together in a bipartisan way to ensure that life-saving resources are available to the men and women protecting the homeland. Finally, I'm pleased to support legislation that Mr. Brecken has introduced to foster greater accountability regarding the millions of dollars spent by DHS on border support contract. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record and without objection, and by agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman, reserving the right to object, and I will not object, would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to use an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by the House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 4470. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4470, to extend the authorization of the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program of the Department of Homeland Security.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Ms. Lee for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Ms. Lee. Strike all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section 1, short title. This act may be cited as the Protecting and Securing Chemical Facilities from Terrorist Attacks.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, I speak in support of H.R. 4470, Protecting and Securing Chemical Facilities from Terrorist Attacks Act of 2023. The Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, or CFATS program, identifies and regulates high-risk chemical facilities to ensure that they are protected from terrorist attacks. This program must be reauthorized before July 27th to ensure these terrorism standards can be maintained and in place to maintain our homeland security. CFATS is a unique regulatory program. Not only is it the single federal program focused exclusively on site security for facilities that have certain chemicals of interest, but it is also a regulatory program that is broadly supported by industry. Our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee held a lengthy and productive briefing in May where we heard from representatives from CFATS regulated entities about why it is important that the program continue. Some of them wanted a longer-term reauthorization, and we also discussed potential reforms for the program. It was impactful to hear directly from these entities about their experiences with the program. Through this 2-year extension, this committee can enable regulated industries and entities to continue to invest in their site security with certainty, while also enabling this committee to thoroughly and thoughtfully evaluate potential reforms. I thank the chairman for the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I look forward to passing this bill out of committee and out of the House expeditiously prior to the July 27th expiration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I'd like to recognize myself for making a few comments. I agree this is a critical piece of legislation that needs to be reauthorized. And I agree with the ranking member. There are a lot of things that I think we want to change. I looked at the amendments that the minority has proposed, and I like the vast majority of them. The challenge is that there are individuals on both in our House and on the other side of the building who have such divergent views about this program that the best way to save it and to eventually amend it is to go ahead with the clean reauth and get it to the Senate with a 2-year clean reauth. Why 2 years? Well, there are some people in the Senate and in the House who want the program to go away completely. They think it's not beneficial. They think it's excessive and duplicative. And in some small areas, I could even agree with that. For example, ATF regulates an industry in my district that makes claymore mines and other explosives for our military, as well as CFATS. So they basically are undergoing two inspections every year, and the duplicative nature of that makes it difficult for those guys, and it's unnecessary. I'd love to visit that with an amendment. Unfortunately, because of the people who are out there who want the program to go away, we have work to do. We have a lot of work to do to try to get this thing to a place where people understand its impact, and that's why we did the GAO study. And sending it to the other side of the building is going to be challenging unless it's one, clean, and two, the number of years we have, because we're really threading a needle here between two very divergent views on the other side of the building. So that's why this thing is in the state that it's in today, a clean reauth for 2 years so that we can study. And I will work with the ranking member to put together a little task force group that can come up with a great piece of legislation, and perhaps even if we can get it done in time, have it ready for when it's appropriate to reauthorize it again. We'll look at the GAO study, we'll look at this working group, and I've also spoken with the chairwoman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, because a lot of these facilities have jurisdiction under that committee. And I've spoken to one member who is on both of this committee and on the Energy and Commerce Committee about perhaps helping us with this working group. So there a lot of energy about getting this fixed. Unfortunately, with the time constraints we have and the various positions on the bill, from my standpoint, the 2-year reauth, clean, get it done, get the working group going and building a good bill and building the consensus to get its support when it's finally written and we attempt to pass it. So I just wanted to share my perspective on the work that's been going on in the background to try to find a way to reauthorize this without getting it killed. So today, any amendments to it, I'll be opposing those, but clearly that'll be the decision of the committee as a whole. But I just want everyone to understand why I'll be voting against amendments that are that actually make sense. It's because with those amendments, I have been told it will not pass. So that is why we're doing it the way we're doing it. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for comments on the amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I heard your comments, but let me just say that your work is to be commended, but it's like without discussion at all with the minority. I would say if this is the path you choose to pursue, I would want you to include if letters are being written or anything in consultation, that you just provide the committee for which our rules call for, that communication. And everything that you've said in your statement, we have no knowledge of. And I would hope that you honor the rules of the committee. It's not that we will disagree, but the courtesy of letting us know that we're going forward. But I want to push back on this notion that these amendments are poison pills. I'm afraid my Republican colleagues may be underselling our own leverage. There's no path forward for the Senate's 5-year clean extension bill, making this vehicle the only one in play. I have, in my history with CFATS and this committee, I've never known us to defer to the Senate and say, well, if they don't agree with us, we, for whatever reason, shouldn't go forward. We are a separate body, and at some point, if there's a difference, then we negotiate the difference. But under no circumstances should we just acquiesce without taking affirmative steps in what some of us consider the right direction. Moreover, these amendments we will be offering today were chosen specifically for the fact that they are narrow, modest measures that will not create new obligations or disturb operations, but still pack a big punch towards solving long-standing issues. Nearly all of these measures, Mr. Chairman, have been passed by this committee and reflect bipartisan consensus from past hearings, past oversight letters, and past Congresses. Historically, Republicans and Democrats have agreed on things like properly training CFATS inspectors, coordinating with first responders. A lot of us represent areas where those first responders are volunteers. And it's unfortunate that those individuals get out of their bed at night to fight whatever the challenge is. But if we can provide them with a measure of security by letting them know what they're about to undertake, I think we're better positioned to do that. I mentioned the West Texas situation where we had volunteer firemen who thought they were going to just a fire, and it ended up ammonium nitrate was stored in the facility, and we had volunteer firemen who lost their life. Well, a robust adoption of one of these amendments will say that we will provide the necessary inspection so that those volunteer firemen who are going to perform that public service will actually know what they're going to. I talked about what happened in Newark at the cargo fire. It's unfortunate that 2 people lost their lives, but if there's more information that an inspection could provide those first responders. We desperately need to do that. We do not have to choose between reauthorizing CFATS or adopting these modest measures that will make the American people no more secure. We can do both today. What's more, if we don't, we'll be right back here 2 years forced into the same corner. Don't take my words for it. Let's take Senator Johnson on the Senate side. Here's what he said in 2018 when he was forced to accept a short-term extension after House Republicans failed to act. And I quote, the House is claiming they cannot possibly consider reforms because there's simply not enough time, because they haven't done any oversight, because they didn't mark up a bill in this Congress. The House Committee on Homeland Security has had years to act. Now I'm being threatened with a false choice: reauthorize the program without reforms or let it die. Today we have the opportunity to act. Let's not squander that. Mr. Chairman, you talked about asking GAO to do another study. I have 15 studies that GAO has already done on the CFATS program, and I'd like to enter those 15 studies into the record.
With no objection, we'll enter those into the record.
Thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. One quick point. You know, we don't have to wait 2 years, but we do have a deadline on the 27th of July. So we can absolutely get this thing going, get it clean. The Senate will do it this way. If we come to our agreement in 6 months, we can reauthorize for 5 years with the changes we implement. It's just between now and the 27th, getting it passed on the floor of the House, committee in the Senate, floor of the Senate. We need a vehicle that can make that happen quickly. And I've been given guarantees that that with a clean reauthorization, 2 years we can get that done. So this is a plan to keep it alive.
Mr. Chairman, just so
Yeah.
we can.
Yeah, sure.
So we can come back, but the Senate has to agree to it.
No, that's true. That's right. We got to sell it. You're right. We'll have to sell it, just like we'd have to sell the amendments we stick on it today.
Absolutely.
But we would just be under a timeline today. Are there any other members who want to make a comment on the amendment in the form of a substitute? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to the First Amendment, and it is now in order to consider amendment. Oh, wait. Before we continue, I'd like to insert for the record a letter from the Institute of Makers of Explosives recommending changes to the CFATS program, which will help guide us as we continue to look at reforms together. Without objection, so ordered. It's now in order to consider Amendment 080 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Pfluger on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a good discussion, and I think deserves the attention of this committee. This is a nexus of Homeland Security, it's a nexus of commerce, it's a nexus of the things that we want to do here in this country and not be dependent upon other countries. As we talk about dependencies in China and other adversaries, I think it's important that we have this discussion. On October 4, 2006, the legal authority creating the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, CFATS program, first became effective. And CFATS requires certain facilities whose possession of chemicals above certain levels to determine present high levels of security risk to assess those vulnerabilities, to implement security measures, and to minimize terrorism risk posed by those vulnerabilities. I also sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee. And these facilities that we're talking about in my district and other members on this committee fall under numerous sectors, and they include chemical manufacturing, storage, distribution, energy and utilities, agriculture, food, mining, electronics, plastics, and many other types of industries. As we have just been talking about, on July 27th, the statutory authority for the entire program is scheduled to sunset. And I appreciate my colleague, Ms. Lee, and her leadership to extend the program. I am disappointed that we're not providing a 4-year extension here. And there's a couple of reasons for that. My amendment would reauthorize the CFATS program for 4 years rather than just 2. And I think that is important to consider, that on the Homeland side, on the protection against the vulnerabilities and the anti-terrorism thought that we have and the jurisdiction that we are responsible for, it helps provide, and industry is asking for this, it helps provide some stability. It helps provide the assurance that the government is going to set the conditions and then allow those industries to do what they do best, which is to innovate and to compete against countries like China and other adversaries. And companies of all sizes invest millions of dollars into CFATS compliance, and they deserve that certainty to know that what they've invested in has an investment horizon that they can have a little bit of stability. And so often government gets involved in things, and we've seen the overreach of other agencies already in the past 2 years, like the EPA and other regulatory bodies that are actually minimizing and tearing down that stability. And so I'm disappointed that we are only authorizing for 2 years, but I am relieved that we're taking action at this point in time. It's clear that you can look at those industries and you can see that people out there have malign interest and that they will do anything to undermine the security of this country, and that's where the nexus of Homeland Security becomes so important. So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to authorize for 4 years. At this point in time, I will withdraw that amendment, but I want to make it known that I believe that this committee needs to proactively take a look at this and provide that certainty while protecting the American public from tragedies and helping our ability to not just nearshore, but to compete specifically with the Chinese Communist Party and other malign actors around the world. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I just want to assure the gentleman that if he so chooses, he can assist in leading this rewrite that we'll go into very quickly after we get the authorization across the finish line. Thank you. The amendment is so withdrawn. It's now in order to consider Amendment 002 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Menendez on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Menendez.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would direct DHS to update CFATS chemical facility inspector training. We can all agree that the CFATS program is an important safeguard to protect our communities from intentional hazardous chemical releases, stolen chemicals, and other risks. I'm particularly invested in CFATS because there are 4 facilities covered by the program in New Jersey's 8th Congressional District, as I am sure there are CFATS facilities in many of our districts. For the CFATS program to be effective, inspectors need to be up to the task of ensuring regulated facilities are meeting the guidelines of the program. This requires robust, up-to-date training. Nearly 5 years have passed since Mr. Jesse LaGrosse Jr., who was the AFGE representative for CFATS inspectors, testified about the lack of training provided to inspectors before this committee. Again, 5 years. During his testimony, Mr. LaGrosse noted that new hires received a single one-time training course, and after that were expected to learn, quote, on the job. He explained that this approach is problematic because the particular skills needed to effectively carry out inspector responsibilities cannot be learned strictly by on-the-job training. Just last month, Mr. LaGrosse appeared at a committee roundtable and told us these issues persist. I would note that the ranking member introduced 18 GAO studies into the record. I'm sure one of those is a 2020 study, which talked about the deficiencies in CFATS training, specifically with respect to cybersecurity. So we do have GAO studies that show the issue my amendment seeks to address has been outstanding for some time. My amendment would help address these issues by requiring classroom and on-the-job training regarding a range of issues that impact risk at chemical facilities, including chemical hazards, chemical facility operations, chemical plant control system, physical security, cybersecurity, and procedures for inspection. It would also require that training be updated on a regular basis and that all inspectors receive annual refresher training. I would note we have heard firsthand from the people who do this work, who are on the front lines, and this amendment is responsive to their concerns. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to help our chemical facility inspectors do the best job they can keeping our communities and our country safe. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs,
Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for a recorded vote.
a recorded vote has been requested. Vote pursuant to Committee Rules 7C. Further proceedings on the vote will be rolled to the end, and we'll try to do all votes today at the end, just because I know everybody is incredibly busy. So we're now going to, is now in order to consider Amendment 001 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swalwell on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Swalwell.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. I also appreciate the chair of the subcommittee, Chair Garbarino, holding a subcommittee hearing on this topic. I think it was helpful in informing us on what needs we have for reauthorization. My amendment would ensure that the CFATS program continually evolves to stay ahead of the threat environment, specifically the rapid rise in cyber threats. Although CFATS does not reference cybersecurity in its regulation and guidance, the program has historically been focused on physical threats. But the threat landscape has grown more dispersed and bad actors are more sophisticated since the program was first established in 2007. Today, critical infrastructure in all sectors are being battered by ransomware and other cyber attacks, often by sophisticated foreign adversaries and highly skilled cyber criminals. This happened in the public safety sector in my own district over the weekend. The chemical sector is no exception. Cybersecurity is a fundamental layer of overall security for chemical facilities. Unfortunately, cybersecurity is only one of 18 risk-based performance standards that chemical facilities must adhere to. The other 17 all relate to physical security. Furthermore, the CFATS program cybersecurity guidance is woefully outdated. In 2020, GAO found that it hadn't been updated in a decade. At the time, CISA officials said they did not have a process to routinely review their cybersecurity guidance to chemical facilities to ensure that it keeps pace with current threats and technological advancements. As the nation's cyber risk advisor, CISA can do better and it must do better. To that end, my amendment would require CISA to review whether the CFATS program's cybersecurity standards measure up to the broader cybersecurity performance goals, also known as CPGs, that CISA issued last year. These performance goals were developed in coordination with NIST as a part of a broader President Biden administration initiative to secure industrial control systems and improve cybersecurity across all sectors. My amendment will keep and ensure that this chemical security program keeps pace with the evolving threat landscape well into the future. I hope my colleagues can support it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the amendment? The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just begin by noting that I share our colleague, Mr. Swalwell's concern about cybersecurity and ensuring that this program incorporates those standards so that it's exactly correct that we have an evolving threat landscape that we must continue to address that will necessitate evolving standards within this program. It would just have this to say, which is I agree, as stated by the chairman, that many of these amendments I think are productive and are subjects that we would look forward to working across the aisle to develop the right standards going forward. Today, I will not support this amendment because of the impending deadline. So it is a question not of substance but of procedure that we hope to move this clean reauthorization today and then collaborate together to identify the best standards and practices to incorporate to reach that evolving threat landscape as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swalwell. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Roll call vote, please, Mr. Chair.
A roll call vote has been requested, and pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings in the question is postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 010 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swalwell on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Swalwell.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also thank my colleague, Ms. Lee, for her guidance. I think we're in alignment here on what we have to do and look forward to a productive way of seeing that through. This amendment, Mr. Chair, would direct DHS to make much-needed improvements to the cybersecurity training provided to CFATS inspectors. In the current dynamic threat environment, we need a cadre of well-equipped, well-trained chemical security inspectors to ensure that the program is effective. When a CFATS inspector is on site at a chemical plant, they must be able to assess whether that facility is in compliance with every single one of the security measures under its plan. Some security controls, like guards and gates, are easier to spot than an unpatched software vulnerability or an inadequate cyber incident response plan. When it comes to cybersecurity, inspectors need to be trained as to what to look for. And if they don't know what to look for, they probably won't find it. Yet, for at least the last 5 years, CFATS inspectors have been sounding the alarm about the lack of cyber training available to them. This lack of training prevents them from conducting real cyber audits and reduces compliance inspections to little more than a box-checking exercise. In 2019, Jesse LaGrosse, the AFG union representative for CFATS inspectors, testified that the closest thing to cyber training that inspectors received was some instruction on how to fill out the cyber portions of the inspection report. Even then, in most cases, the questions that inspectors were directed to pose to facilities were woefully inadequate. For example, they were directed to ask, does the facility have a cybersecurity policy, and can they say if they've implemented that policy? These surface-level questions reveal nothing about a facility's cyber posture and should give us no confidence that these high-risk facilities are doing what it needs to be done to prevent cyber criminals from taking over their infrastructure. In 2020, GAO validated the inspectors' complaints about the lack of cyber training and said that DHS should do more to understand if its training programs are working. DHS has repeatedly said it will expand cybersecurity training for inspectors, but little has changed. In May, at the hearing that Chairman Garbarino held, Mr. LaGrosse told this committee that the only improvement DHS made to its chemical inspector training program is a 3-session workshop in 2020, and even that course repeated information from a free online course inspectors had taken previously. My amendment would mandate training on cybersecurity and all aspects of the risk-based performance standards. This language is not new. In fact, it was passed out of the committee in 2019 when we last moved a CFATS reauthorization bill. It wasn't controversial then. I hope it's not controversial now. I urge my colleagues to support this needed amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Swalwell. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. A recorded vote is requested. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Let's see here. It is now in order to consider Amendment 003 to the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by Mr. Payne on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Payne.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's unfortunate that our colleagues across the aisle do believe that these amendments have merit, but are not willing to move them forward. This committee is probably, should be the most bipartisan committee in the Congress. We all want the safety of the homeland to be intact. But, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity. My amendment would strengthen coordination between CFATS facilities and local first responders by refining existing law to match congressional intent. CFATS facilities are, by definition, our nation's highest risk facilities. Responding to an emergency at any chemical facility is dangerous, but the stakes are so much higher at a CFATS facility as they hold quantities of dangerous chemicals sufficient to turn the plant into a weapon of mass destruction, severely impacting first responders and the communities they protect. Unfortunately, the way things work today, facilities can comply with their regulatory obligation to coordinate with local responders by simply having a plan and a light paper trail to point to every few years when an inspector comes around. In 2018, GAO found that despite the provision in the law, many first responders in communities with CFAT facilities reported that they were not contacted by operators, did not know what chemicals were stored on site, and in some cases did not even know there were a high-risk CFATS facility in their district. All first responders with CFAT facilities in their district should know the layout of the facility, what chemicals are stored on site, have some training on how to safely handle them, and the entity of the security officer at the facility, ideally with regular engagement regarding planning and exercising emergency response scenarios. Giving first responders critical information for any major risk to their community, whether it be a freight rail car traveling through Ohio or a CFAS facility in Texas, should be the bare minimum of what we can do to ensure safety and well-being of the first responders themselves and the communities they serve. Unfortunately, these practices are not being done today. My amendment places the burden on DHS to make sure that first responders have the information they need to successfully respond to these emergencies. First responders, first it mandates that DHS disapprove any site security plan that does not specifically identify the local emergency manager and include a policy to contact that emergency manager at least annually regarding the facility's emergency preparedness plan. Second, it requires DHS to audit compliance with this policy annually. These measures won't solve the problem entirely, but they are a step in the right direction and one that is long overdue. I urge my colleagues to support my common sense amendment and help get our first responders the information they need to protect our communities. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, looking at the intent of the amendment, I think it's an excellent step in the right direction. I'm a former firefighter. Actually, from what I hear from the IFF, I'm the only career firefighter ever elected to Congress. So I understand the importance of notifying first responders of potential dangers in their area. Some fire departments do this pre-planning better than others, but we need to try to get as much information to all the first responders of what danger lies in their area. However, I'll be voting against it because I will be following your lead, Mr. Chairman, and that I also believe that never let perfect be the enemy of good. We do need to look at this program and make the changes that are necessary, but listening to your comments that if we pass a non-clean extension, reauthorization, this may not even pass at all. And so I believe we need to keep what we have and then work to make it better. And so I'll be following your guidance. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
can I ask the gentleman a question?
Does the gentleman yield? He still has.
Yes, does the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Being what you mentioned in your career, would you like to go into a situation where you didn't know what you're up against in terms of fighting fire?
Firefighters never want to do that, but firefighters do that all the time because it's almost impossible to know what's exactly in every single structure that you go in. I do believe that your amendment is a good amendment, but again, I will be following the chairman's lead on this, that if we put amendments on this reauthorization, it may not pass at all. And so I'd like to see the authorization go through, but also I believe and trust that our chairman will be working to put the changes in this reauthorization in this bill that need to happen in the future to protect firefighters or first responders.
Well, thank you, and let me just say that I agree with you with respect that they enter a lot of situations where they don't know what they're up against, but if they could know, I think it's a better situation for them. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields, and I may ask if the gentleman would yield a little bit of time to me, and I just want to assure the committee of a commitment to get, you know, I mentioned at the beginning and entered into the record changes that I want to this legislation about for the explosives guys in my district, but we have a deadline of the 27th. And I know, and I don't mean to be petty here, but it's been mentioned that these problems have been known for 5 years. Well, 4 of those 5 years, the other side of the aisle was in charge of the committee. So, I mean, I get it. We got to make changes to it. You have a commitment to me that if we pass this thing, we will put a group together. I'll send a letter, you know, this week to the ranking member to ask for his members to that working group, and we will then go and sell it to the people we have to sell it to and get this done. I'm committed to that, but I checked. I ran every one of these amendments past the people in the Senate last night and was again told a big H no. So, you know, let's get this thing stable and then we can work on it. That's just my perspective, and I do appreciate the thoughtful amendments. You know, Mr. Menendez's amendment's a great amendment. I mean, these are good changes that have to happen, but we have to sell them. And we can't do that between now and the 27th of July. And I get that it's been a long-term problem, but guys, we took over in January. So, you know, be careful about making that accusation. So, anyway, I yield, and I think the ranking member wants to be recognized.
Yeah, just to get the record clear, Mr. Chair, our committee always did our job, whether Democrats or Republicans were in charge. The question is whether or not we got it through the House. But at no time did we.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah. So,
Point well made and point taken. I appreciate you clarifying that.
and I'm glad we have a full-time fire person. I came to Congress as a volunteer firefighter, and I know a lot of nights that of days that we went on runs, we didn't have a clue, other than it was an incident. And if we can, as members of Congress, prepare those individuals, whether they're paid or volunteer, to have as much information about what they're about to encounter, I think we're better off. So if at some point we take it up, but I think this is a known vulnerability that we think is serious enough to put on the table in this discussion. And if it comes back later, that's fine, but I think from our perspective, it's something that we just need to have in front of everybody.
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Look, we can't, I can't disagree with those statements, but we can't let this thing lapse. And, you know, so getting something done, and then you have, again, my commitment to working bipartisanly to put these amendments and other amendments onto it, and then I will work with the members of this committee to go and sell it, because it does have to pass the floor of the House and then go to the Senate and pass. One important note, we don't have to wait 2 years to reauthorize it again. We can, 6 months from now, 3 months from now, get it exactly the way we want it with the comfortable buffer of 2 years that we have, and then bring the bill back up. So we can't let it lapse. So I yield.
Mr. Chairman.
It's still Mr. Thompson's time. Do you yield? You yield. He yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My subcommittee held this roundtable. Both sides, Republican and Democrat, were there. We had 3 witnesses of the majority, 1 from the minority. I understand a lot of these amendments have great intent, and they are born out of something, but every witness, both the Republican and the Democrat witnesses, majority and minority witnesses, testified that the worst thing that could happen is that this is not reauthorized. They all said it. So I think it's very important today that we continue. And we had a chemical distributor. We had 2 chemical distributors, chemical producer. We had the chemical security inspector who did talk about training and updates to training, and we're going to include some language in the bill report dealing with that. But they all said at that meeting that if this lapsed, having this lapse would be the biggest problem. So I support your lead in doing a clean reauthorization here. I do wish it was longer than 2 years, but I think that will give us plenty of time to address a lot of the issues that are coming up today, the training, the reports, dealing, and as for the first responders, the last thing that we need is the oversight here to go away if this lapses. So I think we just need to push through, get this done today, get the clean reauthorization done, and then, like you said, have a bipartisan working group come together. I'd love to be part of it to make sure that what's done is done, any amendments are done right. So I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else want or wish to speak on the amendment? You recognize, Ms. Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We keep hearing that the Senate won't pass this if it has some of these amendments on there. I just wonder which senator doesn't want our first responders or firefighters to be notified of the dangers they're running into?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
So the gentlelady yields to me.
Yeah.
So in the negotiations between the chair and the ranking member, their differences of opinion are so stark that I want to be careful and respect both of the conversations that I had in their offices. But it turned out that the one thing we could get done by the 27th is the 2-year reauth and clean. And so that's what we opted to do, and they both agreed with, so Senator Peters and Senator Paul. So we just need a Mary in there, and then it'd be. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Just for the record, whatever that conversation, it didn't involve the ranking member of this committee. So, again, Mr. Chair, in the interest of making this work.
Yeah, you've made that point, Mr. Ranking Member, and I will make that happen next time. Is there anyone else who wishes to talk on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Payne. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on the question is postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 004 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Magaziner on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Magaziner.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. And given the conversation that just occurred, I'll be brief. My amendment also is focused on making sure that first responders, and particularly firefighters, have the information that they need to do their jobs effectively when they are called in to address a fire at a chemical facility. So I want to thank the chairman and Representative Lee for reintroducing the chemical facilities from terrorist attacks, securing chemical facilities from terrorist attacks Act. Of course, it's something that we all support, but I'm glad to hear that we also all support the principle that if local firefighters, municipal firefighters, are going to be asked to fight fires at these chemical facilities, they have a right to know what they're facing so that they can do their jobs effectively. And unfortunately, we have seen real-world consequences of people losing their lives because they were called in to fight fires at chemical facilities without knowing what was in there. Most notably in West Texas, several years ago, where a dozen firefighters lost their lives in a chemical explosion, and the subsequent investigation found that if they had known the exact nature of what was in there, that tragedy may have been avoided. So my amendment clarifies that DHS has a clear statutory obligation to provide first responders and other appropriate local officials with the information they need about CFATS facilities in their communities so that they can do their jobs as safely as possible. And if there is going to be a subsequent conversation about a follow-up piece of legislation to modernize this act, then I ask that this amendment be considered in relation to that as well. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Magaziner. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute. A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 005 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Jackson Lee on the roster. We'll roll that to the end of the amendment list. And we will now consider Amendment 006 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Clark on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Ms. Clark.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would require DHS to continue its current practice of making sure CFATS facilities are inspected for compliance at least once every 2 years. Timely inspections are essential to the integrity of the security program. Since current law does not require CFATS to carry out inspections within any particular time frame, the program is an easy target for budget cuts. In fact, DHS has said that proposed cuts for the fiscal year 2024 would impact the current compliance cycle. It could potentially increase the time between inspections from 2 years to a minimum of 3 years. These cuts would also reduce compliance assistance visits and outreach efforts, making the program less collaborative and accessible to the regulated community. I can appreciate that all programs must grow and evolve with the resources available to them. However, it is important to remember that CFATS struggled for many years to get its compliance inspection process off the ground. There was a severe backlog that GAO predicted would take 7 to 9 years to clear. The fact that CISA has cleared the backlog and gotten inspections running on reliable and consistent schedules is no small feat. I understand with this impending budget cut, CISA is considering a shift towards alternative inspection models like virtual technical consultations that began during the COVID-19 pandemic. There may be advantages to using these models, but again, we should proceed with caution. There's no substitute for an in-person physical inspection, and I would advise against short-sighted budget-cutting measures that undermine the effectiveness of this program. So please join me in supporting my amendment to ensure that our nation's highest-risk facilities are secure against a terrorist attack. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Clark. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to.
Chairman, on that, we ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on this question are postponed. And I think since Ms. Jackson Lee is here, we'll go ahead and go back to that if there's no objection from the committee. It's now in order to consider Amendment 005 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Jackson Lee on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
I thank the chairman, the ranking member, and Mr. Carter of Louisiana for their courtesies. Quickly, my amendment is intended to help first responders respond to a chemical facility attack in their communities. Mr. Chairman, for those of us with history, and I know that you have as well, this amendment has been voted, vetted, and approved, I believe, in previous sessions of this committee and this Congress. We know from GAO that DHS is not supporting the kind of robust information sharing and emergency response planning that Congress envisioned under this program. This programmatic shortcoming is more glaring in communities with large numbers of chemical plants, but there are also other urgent preparedness needs that warrant timely attention. To do just that, my amendment tasks DHS Science and Technology Directorate with conducting a 2-year study on ways to improve training and support to local emergency responders in areas with high concentration of CFATS facilities, which includes the Houston region and, as well, many parts of Texas and the Gulf region. The study would seek to create a picture of emergency response capacity in communities with high-risk chemical facilities across the country, and might I add, in Midwestern states as well, East Coast states as well, and frankly, in many other parts of the country. Studies show that these clusters of dangerous chemical facilities tend to be located in low-income communities and communities of color with higher rates of poverty and lower property values. The study would look at questions like, do fire, police, medical, and other response personnel in such communities have the necessary training to respond to a terrorist attack on a facility in their jurisdiction? Do such communities have protocols for evacuation, shelter, and community notifications in place? If so, are they informed by knowledge of chemical properties of materials stored at facilities within their communities? And are they tailored to address the potential implications of a release of other chemical incident on vulnerable citizens in nearby schools, hospitals, and nursing homes? Certainly, Homeland Security also includes some of the catastrophic accidents that we have seen. Are there differences in the level of preparedness for jurisdictions that rely on volunteers versus those that do not? And finally, what training, equipment, and support does DHS provide to such areas, and what more is needed? This amendment is a low-cost, high-impact measure that will help DHS target efforts to build capacity in areas that desperately need it, but it will help our hamlets, villages, counties, cities like Houston and the region around Houston, like the incident of a train derailment in the Midwest that shut down one city, Palestine, forever and ever and ever. And in fact, they're still dealing with it. Or West Texas, that had a massive explosion that no one could explain. It will do nothing to disturb or upend the CFATS program as it exists today. What's more, the study will be completed in 2 years, positioning it to inform the next CFATS reauthorization in 2025. I hope you'll join me in supporting this straightforward, low-cost response to this urgent, life-threatening problem. And I do join with the chairman of this committee, the ranking member of this committee, recognizing you, Mr. Green, but the ranking member of the full committee that has indicated that we have really worked on these amendments. These amendments are contributing to the strength of DHS, but contributing to CFAT's underlying reason why Homeland Security is involved in it. And that is, of course, because we have direct responsibility for securing the nation, but also we're also involved in issues of catastrophic proportion where first responders are involved. I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record an article under USA Today. We don't seem to learn 10 years after tragic Texas chemical explosion, risk remains high. And I'd ask unanimous consent to include that in the record that indicated that the plant explosion triggered by 50 tons of fertilizer-grade ammonium nitrate carved a crater in the earth 75 feet across and 8 feet deep. If 15 people were killed, including 12 responders, but if it had been on a business day, a weekday, there was a school within eyes view of this, stone's throw of this, and it would have been, without mention, unspeakable. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered on the adding the document to the record, and the gentlelady yields. Would anyone else wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Higgins is
As we come
recognized.
to the, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the amendment.
On the amendment, yep.
As we come to the conclusion of discussing amendments that in one way or another reference in federal interaction with first responders at the local and state level, let me say that I encourage the spirit of that intent. However, in the interest of transparency and honesty, I'm going to be a voice of caution as we move forward after reauthorization, and in good faith, we discuss a bipartisan effort to agree to language and legislative address as the committee moves forward. Let me just say that in my previous service to my country as a police officer, I spent a lot of time with firemen. And in Louisiana, there's several excellent fire training academies. In Baton Rouge, the Fire and Emergency Training Academy is one of the best in the country. These guys know what they're doing. And we have to be careful as we push federal interaction into the daily lives and the training standards and certification standards of fire departments that are incredibly well, exhaustively trained already across the country. They do a real good job. And you'd be surprised if you haven't been through one of these academies and spent some hours with your boots on the ground. It's quite eye-opening to come to realize what these men and women are required to know and understand about their potential responses, including within chemical facilities. So I yield.
Let me thank the gentleman for his service as a first responder. Coming up through local government, I was engaged extensively with first responders, clearly Houston Fire Department, Houston Police Department, and others, and the Sheriff's Department. Just in the last 24 hours, I salute the Humble Fire Department that was fighting a plastics fire that is ongoing because of the plastics. And of course, Houston Fire Department has been engaged in helping some of our supporting sister cities on chemical fires or incidences. The point is, DHS is pretty good at engaging the local entity, the local advocates for the nation's firefighters, the nation's police officers, in decisions that they would make. This is a task force that would engage our local fire and others, first responders. So I think the local view would not be kept out of this idea, and certainly we would, in legislative history for DHS to follow, let me plainly say that we would insist that you engage in this effort with listening to the local entities. They should go to Palestine or work with those people that have been engaged. So I thank the gentleman for so generously yielding, but I do think local involvement would be involved in this particular addition to this CFATS bill. I yield back. Yeah, I yield back to you. Thank you, sir.
Gentlelady yields to the gentleman from Louisiana.
I thank my friend and colleague, and I yield.
The gentleman yields. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the...
With that, we ask recorded.
A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 007 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Carter on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Carter.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Did you hear the first part? I need to go back for the record? Yeah. Is it okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay. CFATS facilities are by their very nature at high risk for terrorist exploitation because of the quantities and types of chemicals stored on site. We have seen drones weaponized and used to carry out terrorism. A weaponized drone attack on CFATS facilities would be catastrophic. I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge that drone technology also has many legitimate uses and benefits, but they must be monitored. In fact, CFATS owners and operators hear from put these devices to good use within their own businesses to, among other things, safeguarding their facilities. Nevertheless, facility owners continue to express concern about the threats posed by unauthorized drones. My amendment will require CISA to establish a secure, consistent channel for facilities to report drone activities to trusted officials who can contextualize the information against the threats landscape. As I said, CFATS regulated community has been asking for accessible ways to report suspicious drone activities to DHS for years, and it's time that we deliver on this. I would note that DHS has a strong track record of putting voluntary reporting, suspicious reporting regimes like see something, say something in action, but clearly this is not enough in 2023. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate on the question is agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Carter. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, that we ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested, and pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on this question are postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment 008 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Carter on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Carter.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to ensure that CISA accounts for the full range of health, safety, and economic consequences that would flow from a terrorist act on a chemical plant. Specifically, it directs GAO to evaluate how CISA determines that a chemical facility needs to be regulated and how it decides which risk tier to place the facility in. For instance, does it consider the downstream air quality effects of neighborhoods just beyond the fence line, people that deserve to have clean air and security? With more than 130 million Americans living in the shadows of dangerous chemical plants, many low-income areas that are home to communities of color,
This is a long-standing concern that must be addressed. The CFATS Act of 2014 directs DHS to tier chemical facility based on risk by taking into account severe economic consequences and potential loss of human life. It does not, however, define the term severe as it relates to economic impact or potential as it relates to loss of human life. So when CISA assesses the potential loss of human life, does it consider death that occurs in the months or years after the incident when residents succumb to exposure-related concerns? Does it consider the potential that such an attack may occur in communities that already had heightened levels of respiratory disease resulting from years of compound chemical exposure? What about facility proximity to schools, hospitals, military bases, and other sensitive infrastructure? Is this taken into account? Regrettably, the answer to all of these critical questions is a resounding no. Current statutory language falls well short of what is needed to protect communities and our economy. For that matter, it also does not consider potential damage to local businesses in the event that a chemical release causes damage to nearby properties. My amendment would ask GAO, with evaluating whether the risk assessment methodology used in this program considers, 1, potential impact that a terrorist attack could have on air quality, 2, features of surrounding areas such as presence of other chemical facilities or chemical infrastructure, and 3, the full implication of an attack of fence-line communities. Members, my amendment is measured, it's reasonable, and it does not take massive change to the program to accomplish. Rather, it seeks to provide Congress with information needed to reevaluate the risk methodology ahead of the 2025 and when we would expect the program to be back up for reauthorization. I respectfully yield back and ask for your support.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? There's no further debate. The question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Carter. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to. The ranking member?
On that, we ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment 9 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4470 offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection to reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The CFATS Act of 2014 exempted following types of chemical facilities from the program: those regulated by the Maritime Transportation Security Act, public water and wastewater systems, facilities owned or operated by Department of Energy or Defense, and those regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Some categories or facilities were exempted to avoid regulatory duplication, while others were exempted to overcome jurisdictional objections by other congressional committees. To get this act across the finish line, trade-offs had to be made. But nearly 10 years have passed, and there is evidence that these exemptions are counter to our shared security goals. In 2021, GAO issued a report that compared the CFATS regulatory program with chemical safety frameworks and other regimes used by exempted facilities. The report found that in most cases, water and wastewater facilities were not required to implement security measures commensurate to those levels of security risk, which may lead to potential security gaps. This is very troubling given that the water supply is known to be a target for malign actors, and according to Cyber Solarium Commission, water utilities remain, quote, largely ill-prepared to defend their networks from cyber-enabled disruption. Water infrastructure is critical to national security, economic stability, and public health and safety, but the sector, because it does not participate in CFATS, cannot access the cybersecurity and other support that CISA makes available to other at-risk chemical facilities under the program. We owe it to our constituents who live near or rely on such facilities to explore whether it's time to make changes to the exemption. My amendment would direct DHS to commission an independent third-party assessment of the Homeland Security implications of these exemptions. Wherever you fall on the questions of exemption, I hope you can agree that this study is the right thing to do. Enactment of my amendment will ensure that the committee has the information it needs when we reconvene in 2025 to reauthorize this program. I urge adoption of my timely amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Thompson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to.
Mr. Chair, on that amendment, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested, and pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on this question are postponed. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, further consideration of this measure is postponed pursuant to committee rule. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 4467. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4467, to direct the Undersecretary for Management of the Department of Homeland Security to assess contracts.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it's considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Burkeen for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4467 offered by Mr. Burkeen.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for the purpose of further amendment. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to the committee giving the opportunity to mark up this legislation today, providing transparency and accountability for the DHS contracting procurement process in regards to our southern border. In the 2.5 years since President Biden took office, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has encountered 5.5 illegal immigrants across our southwest border. For context, that's more than the population of the state that I'm a representative of, the state of Oklahoma. As the humanitarian crisis at our southern border continues at unprecedented levels, crucial support services provided by contracting services ensure that our dedicated Border Patrol agents and CBP officers can remain focused on what they do best, securing our borders. And for that reason, this measure, H.R. 4467, the DHS Border Services Contract Review Act, is being introduced, and it directs the DHS Undersecretary for Management to assess contracts for covered services performed by a contractor, personnel along the U.S. border with Mexico to enhance coordination, minimize overlap, and increase cost-effectiveness among these contracts. Federal contractors have provided essential services along the U.S.-Mexico border, and DHS has increasingly relied on service contracts to carry out its operation so that the department can focus on primary responsibilities. Between fiscal years 2013 and 2018, the DHS contracted services increased by 40%. However, it's important that we understand how DHS determines which services require contract personnel and how effective these contracts have been in carrying out the mission. If enacted, this bill is going to provide clarity on how service contracts are developed with DHS at the border and where there may be room for improvement. H.R. 4467 requires the USM to submit a report on active contracts to Congress on the criteria used to determine whether utilizing personnel, contracted personnel for border-related services is necessary. Further, it requires the USM to analyze the effectiveness of contracted personnel in addressing DHS's mission requirements along the border, including how the utilization of contracts enhances the capability for department personnel to perform their primary responsibilities in respect to the mission. It ensures that border support contracts are used efficiently, effectively, and that no lapse in service occurs. This bill requires the USM to provide recommendations and assessment of opportunities for increasing efficiencies with respect for contracts. Also, to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used responsibly, includes a provision that prohibits the department from requesting additional funding to carry out the provisions of this bill. This legislation had bipartisan support last Congress, passing through the committee by voice vote. It did include an amendment by Representative Jackson Lee, which has been incorporated into this measure. Given the critical nature of the southwest border, it's my hope this legislation will continue to have bipartisan support. In closing, I want to thank Chairman Green, committee staff for your guidance on this measure, and urge all members to support common sense legislation. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? There are no amendments listed on the roster. Are there any amendments at the desk to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Burkeen. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of the substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 4467, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 2577. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 2577, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish the law enforcement.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Thompson from Mississippi to speak on his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, I'd like to thank Chairman Green and his staff for working with me and my staff to prioritize consideration of H.R. 2577, the DHS Suicide Prevention and Resiliency for Law Enforcement Act. I introduced this legislation in April with the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, in response to a troubling increase in the rate of suicides among law enforcement officers and agents within the department. In 2022, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported 15 suicides within its rank, the most since 2007. Within TSA, air marshals report significant mental exhaustion and stress, and between 2013 and 2019, 5 marshals took their lives. With a record number of officers and agents lost to suicide in recent years, DHS personnel needs to be able to access an enhanced mental health program without fear of being stigmatized or suffer career-wise issues. H.R. 2577 does just that. It is endorsed by the National Treasury Employees Union, National Border Council, Blue Help, Concerns of Police Survivors, and the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association. The Senate companion was scored by CBO at $2 million over a 5-year period. That said, I understand that current House rules will require an offset for the modest expense of this program, and we are in discussion with DHS about finding an appropriate offset prior to floor consideration. Before I yield back, I want to express my support for the 2 amendments that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, filed to my bill. I encourage my colleagues to send a strong message of support to the law enforcement community and vote in favor of H.R. 2577. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the bill itself? It is now in order to consider Amendment 046 to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Gonzalez on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2577, offered by Mr. Gonzalez.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the issue of mental health is a serious one, and one I have vigorously advocated for policies that provide support for investing in mental health and well-being of our CBP officers and all law enforcement when it comes to this issue. As we all know, 14 CBP agents took their lives last year. This is 14 too many. I believe it is our duty to support our federal law enforcement officers in their pursuit of appropriate mental health resources that fit their particular needs. My amendment is simple. It builds on H.R. 2577 and ensures that all other appropriate external mental health resources, including service animals, are included as the department moves to evaluate and improve their mental health and wellness programs. As a 20-year military veteran, you yourself are a veteran. We've got other veterans on the committee, August Pfluger, Morgan Luttrell, Eli and Crane, and others. If you've served in the military, you realize that for a long time, DOD has used service animals to heal people. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to do the same in this bill. And I encourage all my colleagues to support my amendment. And I thank you, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Gonzalez. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment 45 to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Gonzalez on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2577, offered by Mr. Gonzalez.
Without objection, the reading is to dispense with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Once again, Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to speak on this amendment. The amendment is simple. It will strengthen the language around protections against adverse actions, including any retaliation taken towards anyone that seeks mental health assistance or related resources. Just a few months ago, I met with a CBP officer, and he told me, look, Tony, I know I have issues. I've had to deal with several different children that I had to pull out of the river over the past couple months. But I'm afraid to seek help, because if I seek help, they're going to take my gun away. And if they take my gun away, I'm not going to have the ability to feed my family. So he doesn't seek help. This amendment's pretty simple. It basically encourages people to seek help and doesn't offer any adverse actions for those that are seeking that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment to H.R. 2577 offered by Mr. Gonzalez. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 2577 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee will be in recess for about 5 minutes. Thank you.